cats used to harmonize like, no, don't you know?
Hey everybody, my name is Steven, and thank you so much for tuning into the first episode of my new show, The Miseducation of Economics. My first guest was Dr. Lawrence Berk Smith. Dr. Smith graduated from the University of Toronto with a bachelor's degree in commerce, followed by a master's degree and Ph.D. in economics from Harvard University. Since then, he's had a very prolific academic and private sector career where he taught at UC Berkeley, UCLA, and the University of Toronto, where he was Professor Emeritus at the Department of Economics. Outside of that, Dr. Smith has also held consultant positions and sat on a number of boards and task forces, specifically focused on housing and real estate economics. Of course, with my first episode being House of Cards, we talked a lot about the Canadian housing market, housing economics, as it is such a big issue for our upcoming election. Without further ado, Dr. Lawrence Berk Smith, I hope you enjoy my show.
You still defending them now. Lauren is only human. Don't think I haven't been through.
So thank you once again, Mr. Smith, for coming onto my show. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the first question I kind of want to start off, I kind of just want to talk about how the housing market in Canada has evolved over the years. So, like I often hear people who are older than me that, back in the day in the 50s or the 70s, people say it was the golden age of capitalism, where you could have a, minimum wage job and, work a middle-class salary and you could buy a house for your family. And, the mortgage payments won't be too high and, people can rent affordably. To what extent is that true? And, since the housing, to what extent is that true? And, how has the housing market actually evolved since the Second World War, where, they had that big boom?
Well, first of all, it's not true at all. I was thinking when we were going to do this about other times I've been involved when they've talked about, oh, we have a housing crisis.
Right.
And in fact, the mid-1970s was one time when there was all kinds of crises being assumed. I didn't really think so, but the governments did. And all kinds of things were introduced like they're talking about now. So if you go back into the 70s, Ontario put in a speculation tax for gains made in real estate that were unusually high. It was 20% extra tax. There was limits on foreign ownership. There were all the things that we're talking about now, and they really did nothing. They had some short-run effects, but nothing major. In fact, the problem was so severe that in 1974, and now we're really going back, the federal government introduced something called the Assisted Home Ownership Program. And that was like a graduated mortgage payment scheme where they gave 90%, 95% loan to value mortgages. Interest rates were marked below market and they stepped up a little bit every year over 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, which was going to be then 1979 and 80, the mortgages were going to have to pick up the fact that there'd been the saving going on. So that basically the reduction in the interest rate was added on to the balance of the mortgage at the end. It was called a negative amortizing mortgage because the value of the mortgage went up. Well, in the end of 1979, I was actually in Ottawa, where I was the deputy chairman of a task force on Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And I had a chat with the head of Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And I asked him, how much real estate do you own? And could you tell me it? And he said, no. I said, why? He said, because every day we get buckets and buckets of mail keys being returned to us from the home ownership program that we started. People are just walking away. So what had happened is the program came in at the peak of the market. Interest rates then rose. And by the way, by around 1980, mortgage interest rates were way up in the double digits. So home ownership was not effective for a lot of people. And even under the home ownership program, almost 95% of the people who got loans under this program lost their homes. Of course, by the 80s, things settled down. It got better until we had another crisis toward the end of the 80s. But these crises come and go. And one of the things to realize about them is what we're usually talking about is a high price of housing that makes it unaffordable for first-time homeowners. A couple of things can be said about that. The first is, if you think rising prices cause a problem, think what would happen if we had falling prices. With falling prices, people start losing their homes, they go into mortgage default, you get it, that's a crisis. With rising prices, it's a problem for first-time home buyers to enter the market. They have to postpone their timing for a little while, but they're not unhoused. There's rental housing that's quite good, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing is rising house prices create wealth for the vast majority of homeowners, or in fact, all homeowners. So, and in Canada, 68% of households own their own home. So we're talking about a wealth transfer to these, which may be socially undesirable, and it may skew income distributions, but it isn't a housing crisis to the extent that people are unhoused, or that people can't have anywhere to live or can't buy a house eventually. It's a postponement. And while I'm on that, let me just say, as far as Canada is concerned, according to the OECD, Canada ranks fourth out of its 40 member countries in terms of housing. And according to a US News and World Report, Canada ranked as the most favored country to live in. And part of that's based on housing. So in the idea of a housing crisis, that usually means we have people who go unhoused. It means the quality of the housing is unsatisfactory. We don't have that. We have a bit of an affordability problem for first-time home buyers. And that is pretty much concentrated in two places, Toronto and Vancouver. Because if you look at the numbers, Toronto, to buy a house, right now, the mortgage payment is about 60% of household income, which is median household income, which is very high for a single family home. And it's about 35% for a condominium. Vancouver's even worse. It's around 80%, which means clearly first-time home ownership of single-family homes are being restricted to the upper end. But if you go to other places like Calgary or Ottawa or Montreal, it's quite different.
It happens that Vancouver and Toronto are the only cities I've lived in Canada. So,
but you know, if we were looking about that, Montreal homeowner, it's 31% of income to be able to afford a single family home, and 23% for a condo. On Ottawa, it's 29% and 18%. In Calgary, to afford a condo, it's only 13% of median household income, and a single family home is 26%. So we have a problem, but it's really of affordability, but it's really confined to Toronto and to Vancouver.
I guess to kind of jump off of that point, I'm really glad you brought it up. You know, so I was looking at these statistics from the National Bank, and it kind of went back to what you said. It seems like, you know, there was the 80s, and then through the 90s, you had the recession. The percentage for a 10% down payment, that's kind of been consistent for, you know, the last 30 to 40 years, more or less. But, you know, starting in 2015, you really see Vancouver and Toronto just skyrocket. You know, it was comparative, you know, we'll just go by 2010, for example. You know, around 2010 to 2015, the number of months for Montreal was around, 40% for 40 months for a 10% down payment to accumulate that wealth. And Vancouver and Toronto about the same, about 80 or around 60%, 60 months, correction. Not drastically higher, but definitely higher. But as soon as we hit 2015 and 2016, like that goes up to like the 300s for Vancouver, and Toronto kind of enters the 120s. And then now it's, by 2020, it's at like 280 months. So what has that actually, so it seems like there's an outlier effect in two of these cities that, just suddenly cause all this housing to skyrocket, where you haven't seen the same trend for Canada at the median or Montreal either. And, I have friends in Montreal, they go to McGill and they tell me that, they can get a really nice 1-bedroom apartment for $1,000. And, people I work with who are from Edmonton, from Ottawa, same case. And it doesn't seem to me that it's a matter of population or the economy on a city scale, because, Ottawa and Montreal, or even Edmonton to a certain degree, a lot of people, and the economy is quite good there. So what is actually causing Vancouver and Toronto to kind of go up on these unprecedented scales?
Really hard to know. One of it is that there's been a dearth of people putting their homes on the market. So you're getting a reduction in supply.
Right.
You also had a bit of a reduction in new construction for a while in the mid 20 teens, but that's come back up and it's quite high now. What you did get was a surge in immigration. And I wouldn't put everything on that, but it's part of it.
Right.
In 2017, I believe it is, there was a huge increase in non-resident immigrants. So while they were generally a small number, by the late, I hate to put numbers like that, toward the 2020, 2018, 2019, we were getting about 150,000 non-resident immigrants coming in, and we were also getting a bulge in permanent residents. Most of those immigration landed in Toronto and Vancouver. In Toronto, immigration increased the population of Toronto by 2.1% in I think 2019 or be 2020. That's a huge jump in population coming from one sector. Now, some of it was offset by people moving away from Toronto into other parts of Ontario. And in fact, if you look at price increases, Toronto rose by about 17% in 2020. But Barrie, which is about 50, 60 miles north of Toronto, rose by 36%. Oshawa rose, Hamilton rose, Kitchener-Waterloo's, all of those cities rose over 30% in price. So you got a big migration out of Toronto into the surrounding areas, which caused, and this is even before COVID,
right.
COVID accelerated it, you got a huge spike in prices. Toronto, you still had a bulge in the population. And the other thing is that the baby boom children, which we call the echo boom, they're peaking now at age 25 to 40, which is also the prime first-time home buyer age.
Right.
So now, why it only happens in Toronto and Vancouver, it would have to also be because of supply impacts, because the baby boom effect or echo boom is across all of Canada. The immigration is mainly Toronto, Vancouver. The other thing is the nature of the housing that's being built. Toronto less than 20% of new construction is single family housing. The vast majority are high-rise multiple buildings.
Mm-hmm.
So that also skews the supply for the demand. And where you've had the biggest run up is in the price of single family homes. Another factor, by the way, if I just throw it out, and I'm really speculating because I can't really explain why you've got this sudden burst, other than to say the normal pattern of house price behavior is that house prices go up in a step fashion,
Hmm.
meaning in real terms, they're flat for a while. Then over about 18 months, 2 years, sometimes 3, they make a big jump. Then they go flat. They may even fall slightly in real terms, but they go flat for a while as income starts to catch up. Then they jump up again. And you get that kind of a pattern. And right now we're in that spike. Do I think this is something that's going to persist, this kind of price increase? No. You're getting a big supply response. Housing starts are up substantially this year. The first half of the year, annualized starts, we're running at about 270,000 starts compared to about 200,000 as an average the number of years leading up to it. But it takes time for those units to be completed. It takes time when you get this kind of situation to be able to assemble land, to get your drawings, to build a high-rise unit. And so will there be an alleviation? Yes. There's lots of building going on in the surrounding areas of Toronto. There's a movement out there. And if we had more transportation set up to make it even easier to access these areas, it would help it a lot as well.
I see. So kind of touching on what you brought up there at the end with, increasing high rises. I've only taken like first and second year economics on top of my AP economics, so forgive me for, lack of ignorance, maybe for this next question, but from what I looked at, just out of a personal experience living in Toronto for the last 2 years of my life, when COVID hit, of course, the rental prices went, like historically low for contemporary times. And now it's, of course, going back up, kind of steadying with now that international students are returning, life is going back to normal because the pandemic is supposed to be over by now, but who knows at this point. And, I also, I hear construction right now, I see construction everywhere I go in Toronto, but that doesn't seem to have a huge long-term effect on the rental prices for a lot of the condos and high rises that are, the supply increasing. So, based on what I understand from, supply and demand, the rudimentary is that, if there's that huge supply jump, the price should theoretically, or for the rental prices theoretically should be, going down. So could you kind of touch up on?
Well, now you've hit an area that's really hard to explain in a very simple way.
Right.
But let me point out, the housing market is not exactly a unified market at all. It's a series of overlapping submarkets. And in the case of rental housing, you've got basically 4 kinds of markets in there. You've got the existing older rental housing stock that's occupied. Then, because of the nature of rent control, you have the vacant units of the older housing. And we can come back to this, but basically, whenever you have a controlled sector, like you have in the rental market, together with an uncontrolled sector, what happens is, to the extent the controls work, they hold down the rents in the controlled part of the market below where they would be. And that leads to a lot of demand being higher than would otherwise have been if rents had risen, because some people would be forced to double up, they go back and live with parents, different things. So what happens then is the demand for those units is higher, and it means that the demand now for the units that become vacant and that's freed up, that demand is higher than it would otherwise have been, with the result that the rents in the older apartments for vacant units are roughly 20 to 25% higher than the actual rents that are still being controlled by the sitting tenants. The tenants are in there.
I see.
So that's one segment. Now, the next segment is the new construction, say apartments that have been built in the last 15 years. The first thing to say about that is there aren't very many of them. If you look at the 10 years before rent control came into being, say the mid 60s to the mid 70s, we built in Ontario 140,000 rental starts. If you look at the last 10 years, we built 11,000, 1/10. Because, and the last 10 years, by the way, are better than anything that came between 1975 and basically 2010. Because rent controls completely discouraged people from building new rental housing. Instead, you got a lot of condos being built. But now, to the extent we have purpose-built rental housing, the rents there are higher than the rents for the older units. By the way, they're smaller units, generally speaking.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
average size of, say, a condo has gone down from a little over 1,000 feet to just over 600 feet in the last 30 years or so.
Yeah.
But in any event, the rent for purpose-built housing is higher than the rent on vacant units in the older stock. Part of the reason is it's newer, it's higher, it's built to a higher standard, and but part of it also is it's a scarce commodity. Now, on top of that, you have the condominium sector. And roughly 33% of all condos in Toronto are rented. And about 50% of the new condos that are being built are going into the rental market. The rents on those units are once again about 15% higher than the rents on the equivalent new rental construction, because condominiums are built to a higher standard and there's some other factors. So what we have is really 4 tiers. We have the older rental stock where tenants have been there for a long time. And then we have those units that become vacant where the rent is about 20% higher than the existing tenants pay. Then you go to the newer built rental housing where the rents are again about 15% higher than the vacant units in the older stock. And then you go again to the rents in condos where they're higher. It's those condos that are supplying the bulk of the increase in the rental housing. And so that's why average rents keep going up, look like they're going up significantly. Now, they are going up, but one of the big jumps is we're talking about averaging all these categories.
I see.
And the increase in supply is coming in the condo market.
So it seems
And
like
that's not really what should be built for rental housing, because as I said, the cost of that housing compared to rental housing built, purpose built, is about 15% higher.
so. So 2 takeaways that I have from that is, and I've read about the rent controls in Toronto in the 1970s, specifically when I was taking a first year econ course, and we had an assignment on that. So it seems like those controls are, number one, escalating, like kind of creating an artificial demand for the rest of the market. And number two, there's less incentive to build housing that's other than condominiums. Would that be correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last statement?
Yeah, so the 2 takeaways I have is that, the controls are creating like more like artificial demand for the rest of the different tiers of markets, and that there's
That's
just
right.
and there's just less incentive for people to build rental style or just like anything that's not a condominium.
That's right. For one thing, there's a complete distrust of government. So even though new rental construction is not controlled, twice now we've had housing that has been unregulated, and then retroactively controls have come along and been put there.
Right.
So people say, unless we're going to get our money out pretty quickly from building this kind of housing, there's a good chance we're going to get frozen again down the road. And so there's a big disincentive to do that. And that's the reason people are building condos and renting them, figuring, well, if that happens, we can always turn around and sell those units.
So it would be the least, so the condo essentially is the least, I guess you could say, risk averse investment that, you know, a construction company can make, because it's the most unregulated out of all those, or?
Yeah, that would be a fair statement.
I see.
So the other thing is, though, that as rents have been going up, even in the, as units become vacant, and the market had been tightening in the last part of the I never know, I guess the teens. You've had a lot of renovation of existing older housing stock as well. So stock that had been let go because of disincentives is now all being upgraded. And so you're getting a constant improvement in the housing stock right across the board as well. But there's no doubt that rent controls have distorted the market completely.
Yeah. Yeah, the book that I read about where they brought up Toronto, it was more so an overview of the United States, major cities across the US. And it seems like the case with New York, like Los Angeles, a lot of the same ripple effects in a lot of the major cities. And again, that kind of leads into my next question, is that, you know, if I can recall the National Bank statistics that I've been referring to, you know, yes, in Canada, you know, many of our cities are, you know, up there with higher prices, but it's not really it doesn't seem just like a unique problem that we have in our country. Prices in Tokyo, for example, you know, it's $1,640 per square feet. And then Hong Kong, that's almost double, 3,200 per square feet. And you see that with cities like in New York, Paris, Stockholm, just, you know, across the world. So if it seems to me that, you know, rising prices is, like I said earlier, a worldwide problem. And, you know, as we discussed earlier, rent control, that's, you know, something that's employed by governments, I'm sure, around the world. But what other factors kind of make this a commonality for a lot of the, it seems to be G20 or, you know, more advanced, oh, sorry, I dropped my pen, more advanced economies?
Well, one of the things is that the phenomenon you were talking about in terms of housing costs, even within North America, there's a huge range. So in terms of US dollars, Vancouver, the cost really for new housing is about $800 a square foot, which would be in Canadian dollars, $1,000 a foot.
Yeah.
Toronto, it's about $775, excuse me, which is again, like just under 1,000. But New York is $1,400 a foot. San Francisco is about $1,250. Boston is about $1,160.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's huge variation in Canada and in the States. Calgary, the cost is $335 a foot. Ottawa, $485. And even Montreal, it's $560. Chicago in the US, to show variation, is just over $400 a foot. It's a third of the cost of housing in San Francisco or New York on a cost, on a per square foot basis. So yeah, you have all this. And what's sort of interesting despite that is if you look at home ownership rates, and I'm digressing a little from your question.
Yeah.
In Canada, the home ownership rate, as I mentioned, is roughly 68% of households.
Yeah.
In the US, it's only 64.5%, which is a little surprising at first if you think about it, because in the United States, mortgage interest, at least part of it, is tax deductible, property tax is the same.
Yeah.
You would think that would encourage home ownership more. In the OECD countries, it's about the same as Canada in terms of percentage of home ownership. Sweden, it's about 58%. The EU, it's a little higher than Canada. Home ownership's about 70%. But it's all in that ballpark. And it's interesting, it's in that ballpark regardless of the cost.
Yeah, that's
So the other thing you have to look at is the other side of the picture, which is incomes. Because if I talked about New York or I talked about San Francisco, they've got really high incomes relative to other parts of the country. Same thing, Toronto and Vancouver. So it's not just the cost per se. One other factor I probably should have mentioned earlier on the constraint or how high house prices is that municipalities generally have what they call development charges. Development charges are a charge they put on the developer of a high rise or a subdivision or whatever for to finance the cost of services that those units are going to require. So it goes for roads, it goes for public transportation, for schools, sewers, and parks, all those things. Now in Toronto, the cost adds about 10% to the cost of a building. The average in Canada is 4%. Peel is the highest in the Toronto area at 14%. But these are significant numbers. So when you talk about the cost of a new single family home, you're adding about $85,000 because of development charges.
I see.
So now you might ask, why do you do it that way? and what are the implications? And at first thought, you'd say, well, there's no alternative. But of course there is. There's a whole range of alternatives. But the simplest alternative is to raise property taxes instead. And so if we do talk about this, you can see the impacts of government policy. If we took away the development charge and we raised all property taxes to generate the same income, house prices would fall because roughly 10, 11% of the costs have been reduced. And existing home ownership would cost more because of the higher property taxes. So prices of those homes would fall. And you'd be making a transfer of wealth away from existing homeowners and giving it to new first-time home buyers.
Yeah.
Doing it this way, you do the exact opposite. You're taxing, in essence, the first-time home buyer who has to pay the higher price, and you're giving a wealth benefit to existing homeowners because now their homes are higher in price because property taxes are lower and the cost of new construction is 10% higher. So if you compare those two things, it's who do you want to favor?
Yeah.
Development charges favor home ownership, existing homeowners at the expense of newcomers.
Because it would be a sunk cost, correct?
Well, because they've got to pay the higher price.
I see. Right. But because it's a first time charge, you don't have to. Whereas opposed to property taxes, where it's more recurring. Like if you already own a house, you just have to pay up front, and then you don't have to worry about it later on.
Well, if you've got a development charge, I mean that's a cost of building. So
right.
The cost to the buyer is going to be there. You're right. You don't have to buy. But if you do, that's a cost that the builder has. And it's not likely that he's not going to pass that on.
I see. Yeah. It was good that you touched on the political solutions, because I want to kind of get into, with the election only a week away now, some of the platforms that of major parties. And I'll first start off with people. I've heard all leaders talk about this was cracking down on foreign buyers. So it seems the major parties, they all have their own plans. I'll get into that later on. But every one of them has spoken that, we need to restrict home ownership from people who don't live in Canada, who aren't even permanent residents. And to me, that seems like almost a little bit of, I'm not sure if I'm using the right word, but kind of scapegoating, because the last time I checked, they only account for like 2% of the market, but there's such a greater focus on that specific argument alone. Could you perhaps expand on that? Am I wrong, or am I misunderstanding the?
No, you pretty much have it right. But again, like immigration, the foreign ownership falls primarily in two places, Toronto and Vancouver.
Yeah.
It's beginning to sound like a broken record. Toronto, Vancouver, and then the rest of Canada. Foreign ownership in the residential sector is about 3.5% in Toronto. It's a bit over that, about 4.5% in Vancouver. But in the new condo market, units built in the last 3 years, foreign ownership accounts for just about 8% in Toronto and a little less than that in Vancouver. So while across Canada, it's pretty negligible everywhere else. It's like under 0.5% in Calgary and Montreal and wherever you want to go, Ottawa, Winnipeg. Toronto and Vancouver have an issue.
Yeah.
The question then is, what if you did away with this? And it's a two-edged sword. It's something, as I mentioned earlier, was tried in the mid-1970s. And the immediate effect is, yes, it'll lower prices. But the longer term effect is that price effect will disappear.
Yeah.
It's just a short run effect. And the other thing is that this is providing additional capital to the construction sectors. And also liquidity into the market. And so by turning this off, you reduce liquidity, and that discourages building. And you take out a sector of demand, and so you would probably get less building. And the effect of that would be that you would eventually get prices increasing back more or less to where they would have been in the first place.
Right.
So you get a short run respite at the cost of a lower housing stock. So is it a long run solution? No. Does it look like it'll help in the short run and therefore a sort of good thing for a political party to recommend? Well, yes, because they'll be the beneficiary of the initial effect, and they'll probably have gone on to another career by the time the negative effects catch up.
Yeah.
But as a long-term policy, it really is not one I would advocate, but it does have some short-run effects.
I see. So it's not all folly, if I were to.
Well, I would say there's not a lot to recommend it from a long-run perspective.
Okay. So to get into some of the platforms of the major parties. So, for the Liberal Party, they've talked about tax-free account for, tax-free savings account for Canadians under 40 to help save for a house. And, some of the major highlights is also, sorry, let me just read that. Yeah, so tax-free, so I guess their plan is to kind of focus on, tax-free savings for first-time home buyers and a lot of the just relief from the government side to kind of incentivize through credits and also banning home ownership. But this policy that kind of interests me, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is to restrict large corporate owners and speculators and house flippers. There was like a little controversy back in my hometown where this Liberal candidate, he was flipping houses. And then he was also talking about banning flipping houses. And then he was asked, would you stop flipping houses if you were elected? And then he kind of just threw his hands in the air. It's like, I don't know, we'll find out, I guess. So I guess first, we've already talked about the tax credit part, but can you maybe go into more about the corporation side of it? To what extent would that actually, what effects on the market would that have if we were to restrict the corporate side, versus, let's say, just myself?
The first thing you talked about was tax-free savings accounts and things that will increase demand.
Yeah.
And that's always beneficial, but remember the problem right now is demand is higher than supply.
Right.
And so all you're doing is adding a little bit more to the demand, which will, in the absence of anything else, make prices higher than they would otherwise have been. So what you give in the way of one benefit, you're taking away more or less in the form of rising prices, which will offset some of the benefits. Now,
Yeah.
to the extent that you're targeting those home ownership benefits or those first-time homebuyer benefits, it's net beneficial, and
Yeah.
that's okay. But in terms of making a huge dent in whatever is happening, there were lots of other things that one could look at, and probably, well, I say lots, there really isn't much because the market's adjusting anyway, but the key issue is supply.
Yeah.
In that regard, it's sort of interesting. I think the Liberals talk about wanting to build 1.5 million homes over 5 years.
Yeah, and that's the plan for the Conservatives and the New Democrats as well. Construction new homes.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is that's a lot more construction probably than we can actually get out of existing resources.
Yeah.
But over a short time period, like the first half of this year, we're building just about that at around 270,000 housing starts. So it's not a huge increase in target, but the problem is it's a 5-year target. Targets are a really odd thing. I remember one time I was in Ottawa and the CMHC was talking about what can we do to meet the target, because at that time the government had an annual housing start target.
Yeah.
I forget, it was maybe 180,000 starts a year, and they were running short. And I said facetiously, well, that's not really a problem because next year is going to be really good. Everything looks like it. Why don't you just count some of January starts in December? To which they said, well, we already did that. They did it by sending out more inspectors and,
Yeah.
and saying starts that normally would have been inspected and counted in January. By doing that, they brought it into December. These targets are very arbitrary. The point being, everybody wants to build more housing. We're not starting from a deficient base. We have a really good housing supply.
Yeah.
We have a short-run housing cost affordability problem in Toronto and Vancouver. It will dissipate.
Yeah.
And the other side is we need policies that encourage employment, rising incomes, and that will go a lot further in helping affordability than any of these other policies. But targeting things to help first-time home buyers is an okay policy, but it has the offset of increasing demand. So the net effects aren't that big.
I see. Okay, so on the Conservative platform, and they're mostly talking about, yeah, more or less the same thing, but what I found interesting was removing the stress test requirements for mortgages and change the stress test parameters. Could you first talk about what that stress test actually means, and
Yes.
you know, and how does that actually affect the housing market as a whole?
Well, the government has been worried for a long time that these really low interest rates we now have
Yeah.
may not be something going on in the future. And if interest rates were to go up, when people who have, say, variable rate mortgages at, say, a 2% interest rate, if it went up to 4%, would they be able to maintain their payments? Because that would be a doubling of their interest costs.
Yeah.
In order to try and alleviate a huge amount of demand from people who couldn't tolerate an increase in interest rates, the stress test was put in to say, you have to make sure that anybody you lend to is able to make mortgage payments if the interest rate were 2% higher. It's a little more complicated, but basically 2% higher than the existing rate.
So kind of like a credit score.
Yeah, that's right. So it just means, could they tolerate an increase and be able to make the payments? Would their then payment to income ratio be sufficient that they would be able to maintain their home? And so that's the stress test to make sure that the people are going to be satisfied, will be able to survive a stress on their mortgage payments.
I see.
Removing that will mean that demand is opened up to people who would have failed the stress test, more marginal buyers. That runs the risk of people buying a home now only to end up losing it in 2 or 3 years if interest rates go up. It's a risky move. The idea of a stress test, I think, was a very wise move to try and cool down demand.
Yeah.
And also give people some protection from getting in over their head. You remember at the beginning of this talk, I talked about the assisted home ownership program.
Yeah.
And that was a case where interest rates were brought down, but were rising over time. And when it happened, the vast majority of people lost their homes. They couldn't manage that stress.
Right.
So this keeps people from the dream of home ownership, which gets shattered because of rising interest rates. It keeps things in perspective. It keeps the mortgage market safer. And it's basically a wise policy in a time of ultra low interest rates. Doing away with it reintroduces those risks. It also increases demand and would be reflected probably even in more pressure on the low end of the first-time home buyer market.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on to the NDP platform. Again, more the same thing. The more I read these platforms, it seems like they really have kind of the same focus and then just different caveats. Crackdown foreign buyers, housing credits, that kind of stuff. And for the NDP, what I guess I like to highlight for this one is the sorry, let me just read that. Yeah, so waiving the federal HST and GST, so taxation on construction for new rental units, and the same thing for the Greens. They kind of have a similar policy in a way. And I guess one topic that we haven't touched on, and also takes a big part of the conversation nowadays, is the vacant homes. People who own houses don't live in them nor rent it, just kind of as a stock, almost just a static wealth hold, I suppose. So what they both propose is a vacant home tax. I think the Greens they didn't provide a high number, but so they have an empty home tax for foreign and corporate owners. You should expand on what the repercussions of that would be, and is it either from what we've been discussing so far, it seems like there's two types of solutions. There's the short run, I guess you could say, for a lot of economic policies, that you have the short run band-aid, and then the long term that kind of escalates over time and you don't really notice the effects. Which one would that fall into?
I think almost every policy, what you said, is correct. Let's talk about the HST removal.
Yeah.
First. That's analogous to when I talked about the development charges. It would just lower the cost of construction, and that would be helpful. I mean, that would lead probably to an increase in supply, and it would lower the prices.
Yeah.
But you always have to ask the second question, which is, okay, what are we going to do about the revenue we lose? And what will the consequences be of that way we try and raise that revenue? And so you can't just look at one of these policies in isolation and say, well, let's lower the costs. We'll do away with development charges.
Yeah.
Sure, that would lower housing costs, but then we'd end up with less transportation, less roads, less parks, all of those things.
Yeah.
You'd say, well, no, we won't. We'll raise the money some other way. Then we have to, as we talked about, look at what the effects would be of how we're raising it. Same thing here. The policy impact on the housing market would be to lower cost. And that would be a good thing. But is it that much of a good thing compared to whatever the offset would be when we talk about what expenditure don't we make elsewhere, or how do we raise the money? So again, there's offsets and trade-offs, and
Yeah.
there's short run versus long run. Now, the other question you asked was the tax on vacant units. And to the extent that maybe people, foreign owners, are buying them as an investment or a political hedge, a safety net,
Yeah.
it's quite possible it will have very little effect on the stock, but it'll raise some money for the government.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it may mean that some of these units will be put into play either as rental or be sold, and that will be the equivalent of an increase in supply, and that would be an okay thing. But
Yeah.
again, you've got to remember it comes at the cost of discouraging the investment that was there that led to the increase in the production in the longer run. So again, it's a short run versus long run. You're taking away liquidity in the market by the people who were buying those things. So that there's a long run offset, but there's a short run benefit.
Yeah, because to me, like from our discussion and reading all these statistics and the various opinions out there, it seems like most of the solutions, it's so focused on just like in the short run, and it's not addressing the larger issue, which is there's a disproportionate demand relative to supply, and that there's not so much, the problem is not so much that we don't that our incomes and affordability hasn't actually kept up with rising prices. And kind of to go back to what you were talking about earlier, which is that a crisis would be if we actually had falling prices, where people would get evicted, people can't make their payments, and we see something maybe like 2008 where you had mass defaults and kind of just destroys the market at that point. So, and from what I take away, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the solution shouldn't be so much to artificially try to change the market so that we can build more, or there would be more demand, but we're having trouble. It's a greater problem of people's incomes not being able to keep up with these rising costs. So how will we, I guess this is kind of a loaded question, like how will we go about that so that it doesn't seem to me, or perhaps people can take away, is that rising prices is actually not the issue, but it's that we aren't actually able to, as a society, kind of keep up with that.
Well, let me go. Can I cut into this in a different way?
Yeah, for sure.
And let's talk about what is the rationale for government intervention in the market.
Yeah.
Different people have different views depending on whether you're basically a social worker, you're an economist, various other perspectives. I would say, as an economist, the main one, not the only, but the main reason for government intervention is to remove market imperfections.
Yeah.
So as to allow resources to flow freely. What kind of imperfections could there be? Back, say, in the 60s and 70s, and even in the 80s, there were capital market imperfections. There were at times fixed rates of interest or interest ceilings on government insured mortgages, which meant when interest rates went up, nobody lent that money and there was less housing being built. There was not a good secondary market in mortgages, which cut it off to some extent from the general flow of funds. That was an area where government played a major role in removing these imperfections, integrating the mortgage market with the rest of the money and capital markets. And that those imperfections are gone, but that was a role. Another role would be where there's discrimination. You want to eliminate discrimination if people are not being able to get financing on the basis of
Yeah.
race or location or something of that sort. So that's another area. A third area would be where there's externalities. And by that, I mean where the benefits of housing to society as a whole exceed the benefits to the individual person who is going to be housed.
Mhm.
You could get an example of that if you had really bad housing.
Yeah.
And you would say, well, the poor housing leads to increased crime. It leads to increased health problems. A lot of these social things that you want to eliminate, better housing would improve that for all of society. And so while there's a benefit for the person being housed, there's an even greater benefit for all of society.
Yeah.
Okay. But our housing quality doesn't really lend to that. The housing is pretty good. It's not,
Yeah.
there's not really, outside of some pockets of first nations, there really aren't that many pockets of bad housing. So that that externality doesn't hold. The market perfections aren't that high, except those that are self-created, like rent control, which is a clear imperfection, but it's a government introduced one. So the question then comes, on the grounds of pure efficiency, is there a role and resource allocation? Do we really need a lot of housing policy and housing intervention? And I would say no. Now, there's other perspectives. One might say, well, we need intervention. We want to use housing to reduce the income, the wealth distribution or disparities. And that becomes a separate goal. That's really a wealth issue. It's not a housing market efficiency issue. Similarly, if you look at homelessness, which we didn't talk about, that becomes a housing policy only if there's not enough housing to house the people who are homeless.
Right.
Otherwise, homelessness is really an income problem, or maybe a mental health problem, or some other social problem. It's not that the housing isn't there, it's there's impediments, whether it be income or other things, preventing people from either going into the housing or wanting to. It's not really a housing issue. I would call it much more, as I say, an income issue.
Right.
So you might also look at, well, use it, as I said, wealth or income redistribution, and then you might get an argument for more shifting of resources to government subsidized housing.
Yeah.
And so it really becomes a question of your perspective, what your objectives are. But on a pure efficiency basis and a resource allocation basis, unless you have market imperfections or externalities, there's not a real argument in Canada for intervention.
So it's not so much a housing issue per se. It's, as you mentioned, an income issue. We're focusing. It's I guess you could say that it's how the housing discussion, it's a market externality of a wider discussion based on your perspectives, whether it be wealth inequality or homelessness.
It's using the housing market as the vehicle for other things. The vehicle being removing wealth disparities, improving, redistributing resources to lower income households in the way of providing them with higher quality housing services. And that would get us into a whole question, which is beyond this one, of whether the best way is government providing the housing services, or whether government should give income supplements or guaranteed annual income, and then let the market work. That goes into a whole range of other issues. But the point is, it's a different perspective on the housing market. It's a question of, is there housing market failure? And I would say no, there's some short-run glitches and causing the price adjustments we're now seeing, but in the longer run, they'll smooth out. Or are we using housing for some other social welfare objective or wealth redistribution objective? And then it becomes a vehicle for these things.
Yeah, I see. That makes sense. Well, so we're on the hour, and I think, yeah, so that was basically my last question. But just a fun one to finish off. Usually when I talk to an economist, I like to ask these. Number one, which economists influenced you the most in your career? And number two, if you could recommend just someone who doesn't have an economics background, who should they read? What kind of resources they can go to, you know, for myself and, you know, for people who watch my show.
That is a really loaded question. It really, I sort of don't think I have a simple answer to that.
Yeah.
I can't think of any one economist. There's just so many that have added parts to the whole picture.
Yeah.
I suppose if I were going to pick one or two, I would pick two people you've never heard of. And nobody probably would have heard of them. One would be Jim Dusenberry, who was my Ph.D. thesis advisor, but who really opened me up to the role of housing and mortgage finance and introduced that whole thing to me, where I had no idea how important that was back in the 60s, when nobody thought of housing as other than a footnote. For example, in those days, there were really no journals devoted to housing and real estate economics. Now there's at least 6. There's a proliferation, but it was just a really insightful thing. And the other person I would say would be somebody nobody's heard of, called Leo Grebler, who was one of the early people doing housing market research and laid the foundation back in his work in the, I guess, the 30s and 40s and 50s for what has become real estate and housing economics. So I don't think that's too helpful in terms of readership, because you're not
well, who do you go to,
really dig to find references to these two, but it's nice to be able to give them some credit.
Yeah. But where does Dr. Lawrence Berk Smith read economics news nowadays? Or like, who do you know, like The Economist, New York Times, like, or?
Well, probably more the Wall Street Journal, but a variety of places. I wouldn't want to stick to any one source.
All right.
Again, there's different perspectives.
Yeah.
Just as I sort of talked about with housing, depending on whether you're coming from a wealth reallocation social work orientation, or you're coming from an efficient market orientation.
Yeah.
So too, these different things like the Wall Street Journal versus the New York Times come from very different perspectives.
Fair enough.
So I would say you want to get a little bit of variety. Don't just watch one TV network, and don't read just one journal or one newspaper source.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I know you're very busy, and it's not every day that you get to talk to someone with the credentials that you have. So thank you so much for coming on my show, and yeah, best of luck.
Thank you.